So one of the common questions I get asked is, how do you build a team in this game? And it's really interesting because that is a moving sliding scale. Like, it's not a one size fits all thing. You're going to be constantly changing around everything as it pertains to this game to make the most of what's available to you. So what I can do is equip you guys with the tools that you will need to be successful, and then you can apply that logic, on any individual content that you guys seem to take on. So I hope you guys enjoy. Make sure you hit that thumbs up and subscribe as well if you happen to be new, because 80% of viewers aren't currently. That being said, the like goal for today's video, if it's helpful, is going to be 600 likes, so hopefully we can hit that. And don't forget, so the first thing I want to kind of mention is, when it comes to team building, it depends on what content that you're taking on. Are you taking on a workshop? Because they're going to have predetermined stages. That's going to be the case, or excuse me, predetermined elements. That's going to be the case for any stage that you go into. There are going to be predetermined types that are going to be strong against whatever boss that you're fighting. And so with that being the case, you would want to match that. So as you see recommended here, wind and water, that's going to be the same for all the different rarities of the Vulcan, or excuse me, difficulties of the Vulcan one. And then you move through, this one's wind and darkness. So you're going to want to have that as your setup. And when there's dual elements here, you can mix and match. Like, you can bring one dark hunter, two wind, or you can do one dark weapon on Jinwoo, or one wind, or two winds, two dark, whatever it is. But you can mix and match at that point. But the main thing is, you're not going to want to be using like fire, for example, if that wasn't already clear enough. Speaking of what you're going to want to be doing, you're going to want to make sure that you support a creator if you're not already, because how it works is, and this is only going to be until this date, but after this date, they'll restart this and I'll have different rewards to give out. Sometimes it's the same stuff, but just a little bit later. Basically how it works is, you go to the link in the description, click support on my profile. When you get there, I think it's US only, but give me about a day or so. I'll click this view button and send the rewards to everybody that is supporting me. So basically how this works, so I've got to go in and send it out manually. It won't tell you it's from me, but you will get a lot of stuff. So right now I've got 30 traces of shadows, 300,000 gold, mana power elixirs, essence stones, 1,000 of those, 2 mana power extracts, weapon designs, 500,000 gold up here. There's 2 more codes upcoming and all that fun stuff. And if you're already a supporter, make sure that you go to your own individual profile and go to the support tab and click the extend support button. That'll be right here if you see it. That's very important, because when the season ends, it will make you not support anybody. So you don't want any lapses, and when I'm able to send you guys some stuff out. So make sure that you extend support. If you're not already able to do that, then check back later, but make sure you're doing that. All right, so back to it. So I want to kind of just move on from there, because with that being the basic logic for any content that you take on that you want to try to match elements, there are some wiggle room. There's some wiggle room in there based on what you're trying to do. So we're going to start up this, and I'll use this as a little bit of a proxy. So when you go in with your hunter team, right, there's still a little bit of wiggle room depending on what you're doing, but for the most part, again, I would prioritize using single elements. Now, quick note, we will cover Shadow Authority and all that stuff in a little bit, but that's mostly what you would want to do. Now, if you don't have Han Semi and you wanted to run this team, for example, you could take her off. If you have a good, well-built Min, you can do that. Actually, the best sub would be Isla, in my opinion. If you got a good, well-built Isla above, A3, that's one of the things that you can do while also keeping type advantage, so you're able to keep up with the benefits from that. Now, moving on here, let's talk about the Shadow Authority. This is very important, because Shadow Authority, all these characters have a specific Shadow Authority passive that they're giving alongside their skills. Now, in the future, the shadows will get buffed to some degree, I'm not sure, but for right now, we don't really have the details of exactly what they're doing, so just keep that in mind. But you want to make sure that you're putting in your first slot the primary shadow that you want to use their Shadow Authority for. Like, if you want to tank for whatever reason, you could put them there, or iron, excuse me, and tank here if you wanted to do that. But typically, as the game stands, the best Shadow Authorities are Big Rock, because he increases the skill damage by 12%. Igris, another one that you would want to put there for critical hit rate specifically. Beru does have critical hit damage, but it's not a meaningful amount, so basically he's just a worse Igris, because 5% critical hit damage does not make a big difference. Same applies to this, not really worth it. But the only other one that I would consider using as a primary is going to be Tusk, because on some builds, like the fire build, or for Sung Jinwoo specifically, or with his fire bow, stuff like that. Or like with Alicia in the water team, you would want to have that, but you're pretty much ignoring all the other shadows as a primary shadow. But that's fine because you would put them on your team as a secondary. For example, Serby, great debuffer, applies combustion with most of his skills here, which does this effect where it deals damage equal to 50% of the user's attack every 3 seconds and then increases the damage taken. That's kind of an insane skill, right? So what you can do from there is you can put in this third slot somebody else like Tusk, who would increase the attack of your shadows if you wanted to do that on one of his skills. Here it is. You could also put tank in there for the defense on your shadows and a stun. Like, you have utility you can do in some of these other slots if you wanted to do that. I think he has the defense increase. Speaking of defense, you can go for a defense down with iron if you wanted to do that, and then you can go with blades or egress if you wanted to for more debuffs. But Beru is one that I would also consider using because he does have the punishment debuff as well that he's applying on some of these skills. But these guys are staying out there for a good bit of time and they're helping out your overall damage output. But again, typically you're using Big Rock as your primary, and egress can be on the team for the bleeds he's going to do if you wanted to do that. Also, Kaisel's a really good just flat DPS shadow. So that's more or less what most of the teams are going to look like because you really want that. And it's especially important to use Big Rock with hunters like Amamiya Mirai when you use them that are able to do a lot of skills quickly. Like Amamiya is able to use her skills, and her entire playstyle actually is using her skills post-transformation ASAP and working her way towards that. So next up is some other content. I wanted to cover Sung Jinwoo based content, which unfortunately I can't really show you from that screen. So we will go out of here. We'll just go to story mode, I guess, and we'll kind of work with that as a proxy. But again, if you're not already, make sure you do support and hit that thumbs up. I'd greatly appreciate it. All right, so here's a proxy for the Beru chapter in story. This one, wasn't it weak to like fire, I believe? I think it was weak to fire. Yeah, it's weak to fire. So here's how this looks when you're trying to build a team around Sung. So this is where options really widen. So I typically would like to have a fire element breaker or a breaker if the enemy has a break gauge to match the recommended element. That's one thing that I would like to do. But you have a lot of flexibility here because you can really put in characters that have strong support skills. So for example, Min's going to apply the punishment and Light's Glimmer. And then he also has a passive to increase all team members' critical hit rates and critical hit damage. So you could put him on your team alongside a character like Thomas Andre here, who will also increase the critical hit rate and critical hit damage by 10% when getting beacon shield, and it'll give a shield equal to 10% of Thomas's own defense as well. And then in the third slot, like I said, I would typically like to have a fire based breaker. You can take off Thomas if you wanted to, and like I said, put on Isla, who when she is triggered as a support is going to give all this stuff: HP restoration, damage, shield, critical hit rate, and damage. So there's just kind of a lot that kind of happens there, and she's one of the best support characters to put here. But if I were to build a team specifically with this stage in mind, this is what I would do. So I would put, again, a fire breaker. We have one. You could have another one if you wanted to. You could have two if you wanted to. But I would put those right there. I would grab her. And for my last character, you could either, again, go with another fire character or put a utility character if you wanted to. I like to put Woo Jinchul sometimes for the extra dash, depending on what I'm doing. But I would actually probably put Yu Su Hyun for her spotlight, very strong effect, and also has type advantage, should be able to do some decent damage on her support. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of flexibility with this, and sometimes the character's passives will come in play. Sometimes their weapons are pretty relevant too. But I think that I could take you off, and you could put Amamiya Mirai if you wanted to do that, or not Mirai, excuse me, Malin Fisher. Those are the two best supports in the game, so you could do something like that, or you could just go this is pretty safe. This is extremely safe, right? Like that's one of the things you could do too. So I would also go to Sung and change around mostly everything on him. For example, on Sung, I am changing his skills. Firstly, we're putting a break fire skill on. And then since we already have a breaker on our team, you could go double break fire if you want, but I'm going to put a fire element DPS non-breaking skill. You could also change these QTEs on the side, especially if they have a rune that matches. This one has water. There's a fire one here, so I'm already kind of using that. You don't really need to change the ultimate once you get the better one, but you do want to change the weapons. Now, generally speaking, with weapons, you want to, again, similarly match the element requirement for the stage, so you're not facing any sort of deficiencies and you're good to go. But if you needed a general kind of all stages type build, I'd say probably Plum Sword right here and the Moon Shadow. These two weapons together would be pretty nice. But don't sleep on some of the SR weapons, because there are some really strong weapons that are SRs per each element. This is extremely strong. The Orb of Avarice. The West one was also extremely strong until they got power creep. Once upon a time, it was the best weapon in the game, including SSRs that were available at the time. There was one more, the light bow. I'm not seeing it, but the light element bow. Yeah, there it is. And I also do like the Casca's Fang for water, but you don't really need it so much. But those weapons, don't sleep on them if you wanted to have an SR version. But for this, I would personally try to, again, match with fire weapons. So you would put the Phoenix Soul. If you have Vulcan's Rage, I actually used it for this chapter. You could do that. There's a free alternative that you may or may not have been playing at the time for. Orb of Avarice, you should have, is extremely strong. Don't sleep on some of these options. But again, a cookie cutter thing that you can do and cheese and most content would be Moon Shadow Plum Sword. Like, this combination, I think, is probably the most cheesable one, especially if you have access to, again, the skills to match it and make up for the deficiency. And then you, at that point, have your hunters on your team, and then you worry about the power, which typically is manipulated through artifacts, and you're good to go. I'm not going to change my weapons because I just kind of explained to you how it works. And with Sung, I typically either use, again, one of these two shadows, depending on what I'm doing. I actually really like to use Big Rock with the Reawakening Blessing Stone. It's not on right now, but Blessing Stones kind of depends on what you're taking on as well. Like, that's at your own discretion. But I typically like to use them with this one here because it decreases the cooldown of your skills, and then you get to get the extra damage on the skills, and it works pretty well. But I will say, generally speaking, for story content, weakness detection is extremely strong. Wolf Assassin, Boss Slayer, both very, very strong options you could use if you wanted to use those. Reawakening, like I mentioned. Pulverize, extremely strong. Actually, I would put Pulverize on for the stage specifically, and I would typically use Pulverize, assuming it's a break stage anyway. I would typically use Pulverize on a lot of content. Same goes for Bloodlust, which is this top one here. On the right side, you kind of move away from it later on, but early on, especially, you really want to have daily quests. It's going to save you in a lot of content. That's one that I would not sleep on in terms of Blessing Stones. But the main thing I wanted to really get across is that it's a sliding scale, right? Like, it's not only what you're going to do there. And then again, Baron can go here. That's kind of whatever. So let's actually get out of here. We'll shift and use that same logic on a different chapter that should have a different element weakness. And before it's the same, darkness. Perfect. So with that, I'd apply that same logic here. Again, like I mentioned earlier, you could run a bunch of other characters in here if you really wanted to do that. This guy actually does have a break gauge passive, so you would, and you don't have to do this, but in theory, I personally in practice would put in one of my slots a dark element breaker, and this team would get this done. You'd have support. Jinwoo is going to get this done, right? And obviously, I'm at this point, I'm very over leveled, overbuilt. Like, this wouldn't be a problem no matter who I put here, but this is just general practice for you guys. If you, by the way, on Min, if you don't have that critical passive, I wouldn't really use them as a support so much. I would probably move elsewhere, like to Thomas or something like that. Or again, you could go double dark if you wanted to do that. I like Libora's charm that she can apply. Very, very strong. You can go double breaker if you wanted to do that. You could put Wu Jinchul there, who's an off element breaker, but will give you utility because you already do have another breaker. And depending on how many breakers are on your team, if the enemy does have a break gauge, then you can actually lean more into just pure DPS build with Sung if you wanted to do that. Or you can keep Pulverize on, or the other one that's based on critical hits, whatever you can do there in that slot. The critical hit Blessing Stone that reduces enemies gauge. But for me personally, I also like the attack increase here. It's fun. 20% is pretty good. But it just depends again on what you're trying to do. But those two specifically will really get this done. You don't really necessarily need the dark character team third. She's not doing much for you. But I would say Libora is a good third if you really wanted to put for the Stark team specifically, because again, she does do that charm and it's very, very strong. And I think she may have a passive increase. Oh, it's her own critical hit bonuses. That's fine. Yeah, so you could do that. And then again, same exact setup for shadows. It's either going to be one of these two, right? Just depending on what you want it to do. But yeah. Okay, and I kind of already talked about Moonshadow Plum, but Plum is one where you typically want to leave it on no matter what, because the critical bonuses it applies are useful in any game mode, which is why I said it's one you can use anywhere. But if you didn't want to use Plum, I typically would move away from the spear now, or the scythe, excuse me. The scythe's okay. It's not bad. It's just not the best anymore, in my opinion. But I would use Zeke's. If you have Zeke's, specifically, Zeke's would absolutely deal with this, but obviously you could use this. You could, since you have the Plum actually on the team, you could put whatever. And if you don't have Plum, that's okay. You could use other stuff here too. I don't think there was a dark SR weapon I particularly liked. I liked this thing, but I never decided to build it. It's kind of cheeky, kind of funny looking, but I'm sure you can make use out of it. But again, if you have Plum, you could put whatever in this last spot if you wanted to. It could be the Thetis Grimoire for freezes. It could be a bunch of different stuff. It's up to you what you want it to do. It could be the longsword. It could be the scythe. The scythe is free, so I guess we'll put it there for now. We would shift over to our skills, and this is the best DPS dark damage skill in the game. Magnifying slashes, you would want that. You also have an almighty break for dark element down here, so I would pair those two together and call it a day. There's also a dark death stance if you wanted that. But those are the only skills I would really consider for this. Like, I'm not really touching much else in terms of dark. The counter one up there can be useful. Multi-strike dark I used a good bit, but you kind of move away from multi-strike as you get deeper into the game. Like, you don't really need a medium breaking attack. Yeah, that's mostly what I would just use. Like, I would go with that and call it a day. So the dark element one here, the dark element one here, and I'd call it. Like, we would run through this, right? But again, it just kind of depends on what you're taking on, and wanted to make that very clear. And again, the fact that there are a lot of different flex choices you can make depending on what content you're taking on. Again, does the enemy have a break gauge? Do they not? Do you need support? Because you can go full support. You can go Min or Thomas or maybe Akari if you wanted to do that. You could go Yusukyun, you could go Isla here, the chick in the red dress right there. You could go Maylin, of course, amazing character. Do you need just pure DPS? Amamiya, she's probably the hardest hitting support in the game. You also can go with fun support characters like what's her name? Iso could be your support character too. She's got some support utility too. Hansumi I haven't talked a ton about, but she could be that character for you too. It just, there's a lot of options that you have. I also really like Go as another character you could put here. Increase the user's defense and gives a shield, and then the user's light damage increases. So on a light team, also having the break, on a light team, Go could be pretty strong. And I'd assume that his weapon takes effect as well, which increases your overall light damage, I believe. So just kind of interesting stuff. And again, depends what you're doing. I've said that so many times because it's true. I don't think there's a general one shoe fits all, best always use this. But if I had to say definitively, here's what I'll say. If I had to say definitively, if you're new to the game and you wanted to just absolutely put something together to try to run through the game, regardless of elements, regardless of any of that stuff, this is what I would recommend. And we'll shift this up a good bit. So you could do Scythe, but like I mentioned earlier, Moonshadow Plum. And then for the characters, some of these characters that depend, like he's dependent on that first dupe, I think, to really truly shine. She's dependent on the third dupe, actually. You have to get the third dupe. Maylin, it shouldn't matter what you do here. Like, she gets better with that fifth dupe by a lot, but it shouldn't matter. Yeah, the fifth dupe is mainly for actual usage. So yeah, I would say Maylin or Min with that first dupe. I think that's much easier to acquire. I would also say, we'll have some real fun now. Her stun is really nice. Paralyze, I would consider her. Her paralyze is really nice. Obviously, her team at this point is leaning more dark. Let's work together. And then I would consider Isol as well as my third. Increases the target's damage taken while also doing the break stuff. That's really strong. So something like this within reason anyway, depending what you have, I think is something that would be a good target for most players to start the game with and be successful with going forward. But obviously there's a ton of mixing here, so it's going to largely depend on your power levels and what you're taking on to determine how successful you are. And so the last thing I wanted to kind of cover is Guild Boss and Power of Destruction specifically. I'm not really going to cover Battlefield at time because this one is it's on a per battlefield basis, what you're taking on and how big your characters are. It's largely just a race. That's all that one is. Like it's a scoring race. So this one is based on how much damage you can output. And so I kind of just autoed this, and these are the teams that I used personally. As you can see, the Wind and Dark was kind of what was happening here. I opted for some more support on the first run, but my song was Wind Dark and I was doing that stuff. You have a lot more flexibility with what you can do here, specifically if you wanted to do that, especially on which element days it is. Obviously different hunters will have relevance, and there are hunters like Choi that I think is really good here that you don't necessarily need. And this isn't some sort of killer score or anything like that. This is going to rank me like 30 or something on my server, which is good, I guess, but it's not anything crazy. But I don't take this super crazily seriously anyway. I'm not trying to hit number one. But you see my second team, I opted for Full Dark, wanted to see what that could do. Both teams scored nearly the same, and I'm pretty okay with that. But the thing is with this, it's based on how much damage you'll do, so you don't have to worry so much on breaks. You can lean more into supports and stuff like that and get things done. And it also depends on which artifact sets you're using on your hunters, how viable they are in the content as well. Guild Boss, this is entirely different because this is the only mode where it's like this, but you can actually bring a host of characters on your team and it plays out entirely differently. So I haven't updated this admittedly in a while, actually since the Dark team gained relevance. This is something I was using for a while, changing Sung Jinwoo around a good bit and making Sung more of a supporter with Thetis Grimoire, Moonshadow, but I haven't changed my guild setup here in like 3 or 4 months. So this is something I was using, found good success with it, just kind of kept it, but I would now probably change this around, maybe take this left column off and put Fire Hunters there, and I think that I'd be pretty happy with that build. But we have mostly the best supports in the game on this team. We got some good DPS characters, and yeah, it's been pretty good for me. I typically am doing like 2 million per attack. I think it's 2 million, something like that. I'm not sure. Maybe it's more than that. I'm not really sure. But with that mode, it also is just a little bit different because it depends on what you're doing. But the good news is all the hunter elements work there. You do need a breaker or two, but Sung winds up being more of a support character because he can't keep up with the damage as some of the other characters do. So ultimately, again, I guess my game froze. It depends what you're doing. I said that 1 trillion times. Take a shot every time I say it. I've got to wrap this up, but support if you're not already. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could. Have an awesome day, and I'll see you all next time.